Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to see you. Good to see you, folks. Excited for this conversation. We have Adnan Husain today from the Adnan Husain Show, which people should subscribe to. There's a link in the show description. It's a new YouTube show. And of course, most of you probably know him from his work for many years as the co-host of the Guerrilla History podcast, which is one of our favorite, podcasts other than ourselves. And then, of course, the Majlis, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a podcast as well, which I know is associated with, more of his work around religion, spirituality, and so on. And so, anyways, a lot of great work, and amazingly, we've never collaborated, which is like, it's an oversight on my part, because obviously I've collaborated with folks from Guerrilla History in the past, and it just has not happened to this date. And so we're excited to make this happen today and to talk about a topic. I saw this first. Also, shout out to Sina Rahmani from the East is a Podcast. He had Adnan on a couple months ago, I think, and they did a discussion on the Crusades. And I was like, yeah, this is, I mean, since the start of, since October 7th, 2023, and since in particular the response of, the so-called state of Israel and the United States and the West to the way that they have engaged this war, I've thought a lot about how there's just some deeper stuff that's going on as well beyond, obviously there is all the material aspects. There is, and we've talked about that a lot on this show with folks like Max Isle and others. But, there's also just a kind of way that Westerners invoke civilizational discourse, often. And then obviously there's the kind of way that things get talked about in terms of holy war and so on. So, you know, I'm looking forward to having a little bit of a different conversation, a little bit of a historical conversation, really about a history that I'm not too familiar with, as I'll, address further as we get started, because a lot of my historical knowledge just doesn't really go back that far. I haven't studied a lot of what happened in, you know, 11th, 12th, 13th century. And, obviously I'm familiar with the Crusades at a very kind of, you know, low level, but it's not something that I spent a lot of time studying. And so, anyways, our guest, Professor Adnan Husain, co-hosts the Guerrilla History podcast and is the former host of the Majlis podcast. He is an associate professor in the history department and the director of the School of Religion at Queen's University. He is also the co-founder and director of Muslim Society's Global Perspectives at Queen's, a project for sponsoring research, curriculum, and public education, which embraces the study of Muslim cultures and diasporas that span the globe. And then again, recently, Adnan has launched the Adnan Husain Show on YouTube, which you all can check out. There's a link right in the show description. I encourage everybody to subscribe while they're here. Adnan, welcome to the show. I don't want to say more before bringing you to the stage. It's good to be with you.
Thanks so much for your invitation. It's wonderful to be on Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, one of my favorite podcasts for sure. And you noted how you've collaborated with a couple of my co-hosts and former co-hosts. And I just feel that there's a serious kinship with the project in terms of the kind of intellectual seriousness about left ideas. And, I'm just honored to be on. It's great to meet you too.
It's great to meet you, and I'm really happy to do it. And I feel exactly the same way about the work that you're a part of, and along with your co-hosts, comrades. And so this has been a long time coming, and I'm excited to do it. And folks, of course, take a minute, like the video, subscribe, and share it. Get it out in your social media. Let other folks know this conversation is going on. If you appreciate it afterwards and want to share it with folks, do so then as well. So I don't want to go too deep into the weeds because we're talking about like, you know, 200 roughly years of history at least when we talk about something like the Crusades. But also, as I mentioned up front, I don't want to assume a high degree of background knowledge with folks on what the Crusades actually were, because I feel like this is a kind of reference point in the West. It's something people are aware of. It's something that has a kind of mythological resonance, or maybe metaphysical resonance for many, but it's not something that I think folks actually have that much knowledge about in terms of what they actually were, that was more than just one crusade. Obviously there's plural, and even in a lot of I took some history classes obviously about Europe, and I don't ever remember really going back before about 1450. And so which is interesting. I think that's one of the things that we'll get into, is that really Europe wasn't actually a thing in the time period that we're talking about yet. Um, but could you start just giving kind of a thumbnail sketch of your own, and maybe some high level reasons as to why this has become an object of study for you personally?
Sure. I agree completely that everybody knows something about the Crusades and has an image of it, but it seems like it's a remote or almost romantic, adventure that Europe was on. But it's something that doesn't have relevance to today. And I'll admit that when I first started getting interested in studying medieval history, particularly religious and cultural relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the Crusades were not top of my list to study because I was interested in cultural and intellectual relations, religious relations, thinking about maybe alternate discourses and narratives to civilizational conflict. Of course, you mentioned civilizational kinds of discourses that are important and that surround kind of popular discussions about the Crusades as the war, a set of wars between Christianity and Islam, as if these religions and religious systems themselves were states and territories and civilizations that would be in military and ideological kind of conflict. And I was very interested in subverting that kind of Eurocentric way of thinking about the world as somehow in conflict with Europe, that Europe had a special genius historically that allowed it culturally to dominate the world, and that it was the apex of a certain kind of idea of civilization. And also, of course, Samuel Huntington's ideas that were very popular in the early 90s when he first wrote this article. I think it was like in the Atlantic Monthly, or was in the New York. I think maybe it was in actually, no, it was Foreign Affairs. It was in the, kind of foreign policy journal, Foreign Affairs, where he, posited that in the absence of the ideological conflict between capitalism and communism with the end of the so-called Cold War, that there would be which was he characterized as a civil war of the West, right? He said, well, these are just two different components of Western civilization that were warring with one another. And it was a bit of a detour historically, and that after the Cold War, there would be a return to a longer, deeper history of civilizations, of culture, essentially determining difference in the world and providing some kind of rationale for geopolitical conflict. And he, believed that, Western civilization was one civilization among seven, sometimes eight. He's like, he couldn't really keep count. Did Africa have a civilization? Could you call it African civilization? Some really zany, loony things. But this kind of really dominated in that era of trying to find a replacement for how to arrange geopolitical affairs under a unipolar, hegemonic West that was busy congratulating itself. And in some ways, he was more of a pessimist. He was saying, well, we're still going to have problems. We may be strong, but there's no way to have this neoliberal order of globalization without various kinds of conflicts. And in some ways, I was trying to respond in my own work against this idea, thinking that, somebody like Edward Said, for example, who wrote many essays responding to Samuel Huntington in that 90s and 2000s, when his ideas became, it seemed, almost ratified by the 9/11 attacks and George Bush's global war on terrorism. Edward Said talked about how cultures always developed in dialogue with one another, in relation to one another, and that there wasn't some irreducible uniqueness to a civilization, but rather that historically they developed and changed and were in contact with one another, and that was the real story. So I was always interested, what is the story of the medieval Mediterranean world, and could we see it as a shared space where of course, there were conflicts, social conflicts and military ones, but what about the patterns of interchange, interaction, intersection that may have been part of the way in which the societies and cultures and polities around it developed in tandem in relation to one another? So that was the kind of thing I was more interested in. But of course, when George Bush declared the global war on terror, he called it a crusade. He took it back, but in a famous speech, he said, this crusade, will go on for a really long time. And it seemed to be validating the idea that there was civilizational conflict that preceded the present moment and that would extend far into the future because it was a necessary kind of conflict, which was the Huntingtonian kind of idea. So I started to get more interested in what was the relationship between things like anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, white supremacy, settler colonialism. It just seemed to me the deeper you went into the history of the Crusades, the more important and significant it was. When I started studying medieval history in like the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, nobody was interested in the Crusades. That was for military history buffs who glorified, knights in shining armor and sword play and shields. And it was just sort of not considered a very serious, avenue for really trying to understand pre-modern culture and societies and religion and all of that. So people weren't studying the Crusades, but there always was a group that was interested in it, but the kind of people who were mostly interested in it were people who thought the Crusades might have been a good thing. One of the greatest historians of the later 20th and early 21st century, really the doyen of Crusade studies, was this guy, Jonathan Riley Smith, who was a cultural conservative, Christian. I can't remember if he was actually Catholic himself, but I remember he organized a conference at the Gregoriana, the University of the Vatican, that was a kind of revisionist look at the Crusades. Were they really all that bad, and weren't there some good things about it? And maybe it was in defense of, Islamic expansion, and it was a natural response. And, like a lot of these kinds of ideas were really important. And he's somebody who wrote a very famous article. He wrote so many things, but one article really sticks with me, which was titled "Crusading as an Act of Love." Okay, so he was interested in how it was Christian charity that had motivated these pietistic concerns to sacrifice on behalf of Eastern Christians who needed to be saved. It was a responsibility to protect, really, is what he was trying to argue. He didn't formulate it in terms of this international legal doctrine for justifying humanitarian intervention by the West, but when he wrote these things, it really resonated with me because we were living in the era where a new attempt at rationalizing Western imperial intervention around the world was being worked out. And it seemed to me, well, there was so much in the history of medieval societies around the Crusades that was being repurposed, whether people were even conscious of it or not. And that's where the idea that perhaps the Crusades were important even once society, at least its political elites and its rationale for nation states, was secularized. Were there deeper structures that perdured and that had an effect that, like, maybe you might change the character of the content, the flavor of the wine, it was red wine, and then you replaced it with, white wine, but the vat, the bottle, the, shape and the container of it was, really similar. So that's the kind of things that I started to think about is in the age of genocide, answering questions like why the whole West seems so deeply invested in the state of Israel. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about these things. But what got me attracted was thinking, was there a connection somehow between things like anti-Semitism that we're aware of for a long period of the West's history with crusading? And there was a very important book, and I'll just sort of conclude with this. There was a very important book that really changed medieval studies, you might say, a controversial thesis by R.I. Moore called The Formation of a Persecuting Society. And it was all about how groups like Jews, heretics, lepers, prostitutes, all kinds of different groups that were seen as marginal were invented in a way as part of a vocabulary of organizing political and social and economic life in the West. And that once Europe became, according to R.I. Moore, in the 12th and 13th centuries, a persecuting society. All societies have persecution, but became defined by a persecution complex as a kind of root metaphor for how it was going to organize relations between groups within society to create marginal groups that had to be surveilled, had to be suppressed, that were seen as inimical and dangerous and a threat to the very fabric of society. He argued it never, abandoned this. And yet you could see this in like the witch trials of the early modern period. You could see it in the conspiracy theories, that were part of, anarchistic and communistic politics being absolutely suppressed and so on. But what was interesting about this really kind of powerful thesis that, of course, many people have debated and so on, but what was interesting about it is that although he talked about Jews and heretics, he never talked about Muslims, even though over the course of hundreds of years, there were large Muslim communities in the Latin West, in medieval Spain, in the Balearic Islands, in Sicily. For hundreds of years, there were large groups of Muslims, and that many of the injunctions that he was studying about church councils that developed strategies for segregating Jews from the rest of Christian society because of fears about miscegenation, about sexual contact, and so on, that these same, injunctions were actually about Jews and Saracens. Saracens being the word used in medieval Latin parlance and in Old French to talk about the Arabs and the Muslims. Yet he ignored that whole kind of history. And secondly, is that in this transformation that he was talking about, even though the earliest and large-scale massacres and pogroms of Jews began with, really, you could say, the preaching of the First Crusade, and continued with every subsequent crusade, it was attended by violence, massacre, suppression of Jews. That he didn't ask the question why this was the case and was it connected to his thesis. He said, no, this is just kind of epiphenomenal. It has to do with other things. There's some other process at work. And he tried to explain how, there were changes taking place in medieval society and the formation of proto-states and new people who were being trained to be administrators and bureaucrats and in the schools. And they saw these other groups as threats to society. And okay, fair enough. But it was ignoring a serious part of the story. So what I wanted to do and what I'm trying to work on in a work I'm calling The Formation of a Crusading Society, is to suggest that the narrative of Europe's development needs to incorporate the fact that Europe, or the Latin West, even before you would call it Europe, but it's the Latin West, the lands that the Pope, that recognize the Pope as the supreme pontiff and adhere to, the dictates of the Church, of the Catholic Church, that you cannot really talk about the development of the West, of the Latin West, of Christendom, without really incorporating the idea and the experience, not only the ideological kind of ideas around crusading, but that 200 years of mobilizing for war, of periods after the First Crusade, which was very successful in conquering Jerusalem in 1099, the states that were established, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Latin Crusader states, were constantly on the defensive. First, with the loss of Edessa, one of the four counties, four principalities, you might say, or polities that were established in the course of the First Crusade. It fell, it was under pressure starting in very soon, but already by 1119, there's the Field of Blood, Ager Sanguinis, and then a couple of decades later, it falls to a Turkic warlord named Zangi, and the Second Crusade is organized. And then Salah-ad-Din defeats the combined armies at the Battle of Hattin, and subsequently captures the True Cross and recaptures Jerusalem. And then there's the Third Crusade. Basically, this continues until 1291, when the last outpost in Akka, or Acre, falls in 1291. You have series after series of wars, of mobilization across the Latin West. And it just seemed to me you could not talk about the development of states, the development of an idea of Christendom that translates in secular form to Europe, Western Europe. You could not have an understanding of what's changing in this society if you didn't think about what the role of the Crusades might be in the formation of Europe and the trajectory of its development. So those were the kinds of things that I was really interested to explore, and that I hope to do so, in my continuing work.
Right on. Yeah, I kind of want to ask just a little follow-up, which is, how were they inaugurated? Like, what was like, how did you convince people, like, hey, we're going to go march? Because I mean, looking at this stuff just a little bit, I mean, these people like march for like years.
Yes.
I mean, it's like grueling ordeal. And then eventually, by the time you get to the Third Crusade, like Richard the Third, like they take a ship, but they have to port constantly because they're always running out of food and water. And so it's just like the whole thing of even the journey to get all the way to where they're going, which, you've already kind of laid it out, but it's like, this is the modern day Levant. We're talking about what would be like, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, so yeah, just say a little bit more about those mechanics of like what made this happen and why.
Well, this is a great question, and so much has been written about the origins of the Crusades, because it did seem, and particularly to 19th century critics, it seemed like a vain romantic folly, right? It's like, what were they thinking that they were going to, take, especially the call that comes for the First Crusade, when Urban II in 1095 gives this, famous sermon that we have multiple different versions that have different emphases, but some kind of clear themes. In 1095 in France, at this place called Clermont, a church council that's held, and propounds this idea. It was building upon a kind of form of penitential piety, where pilgrimage to Jerusalem and to other pilgrimage centers, like Santiago de Compostela in northern Iberian Peninsula, or Rome, but Jerusalem was the highest prestige and the one that afforded the greatest spiritual reward of achieving forgiveness for one's sins. And there was this kind of piety that was developing that surrounded itself more on following in the footsteps of Christ. So when you have in Matthew the injunction in the gospel, where Jesus says, if you would follow me, go sell all you have and take up your cross and follow me, right? So they saw themselves as a kind of one idea of the crusade was that it was an armed penitential pilgrimage to go to Jerusalem, but en masse with a large force, and to, in some sense, avenge the fact that Christ in his own city had been subjected to pagan, polluting, corrupting rule, right? So there was this kind of devotional piety that it played upon. I think already there were Latin Westerners who served as mercenaries in the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire and had come to be involved in the politics and military affairs of the Eastern Mediterranean. And during this period, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, had lost a lot of territory to the Seljuk Turks, a migrating group of Turkic tribes, peoples from Central Asia that had converted to Islam before they migrated into the Middle East, and thus in their conquest, essentially, of those territories, were able to be legitimate sovereigns of a sort. And they also moved not just into central Islamic lands, but into Anatolia, the Anatolian Peninsula, which was the heartland, you might say, the non-Balkan heartlands of the Eastern Roman Empire, took that over. And so the Eastern, Roman emperors made a call to the Latin West, to the popes, and said, you've got to help us, please send aid. Probably what they had in mind was more mercenaries endorsed by the Pope, but what they got instead was an enthusiastic army of not only many nobles who answered the call, people who were within feudal society tasked with military kind of functions, in order to hold their land. They held their lands as fiefs, not the kind of same understanding of property, but that they had rights to the land by providing military service to their lords. And in this case, Jesus was sort of like your Lord, and you needed to go avenge him, And but in addition to these nobles, it really touched off a passionate and pious response among many people. And there were other preachers, popular preachers, like a very famous figure, Peter the Hermit, who had some millenarian and messianic kind of ideas that going on a massive pilgrimage to restore the Holy Land, as it was now being increasingly thought of. It wasn't really called the Holy Land before, but now the Holy Land, to Christ's sovereignty, would perhaps usher in his second coming, that there would be a fulfillment of history taking place. But these were rather kind of eclectic and odd, apocalyptic ideas that reversed the typical way in which Christianity had understood itself. This was a very kind of we are fulfilling an Old Testament or Hebrew biblical narrative, as opposed to what had been more dominant, which was, some early critics of the Crusades said, well, the heavenly Jerusalem is not some city out there in Palestine. It's, Jerusalem is this heavenly a city of God. Augustine talked about the city of God, is the heavenly Jerusalem. Don't worry about if you lost Rome when the Roman Empire has collapsed and was overrun. Don't worry, there's the city of God. That's Jerusalem. That was the spiritual ideal that monks created in their cloisters, right? An idea that this is the heavenly Jerusalem. So some of them said, why are you chasing after this terrestrial, earthly, profane kind of understanding of Jerusalem? When salvation has come, you spiritually need to connect to it. So it was kind of interesting. The way in which you could explain it happening is that there was a certain kind of devotional piety that reversed some of these theological and cultural ideas into re-territorializing them and into inserting the Latin Christians as the inheritors, in some sense, of those biblical narratives that should be lived out again, and that maybe those would be the culmination of history. And so they went on these thousands of miles walk. Most of the Crusaders who departed by foot, going east from Germany into Central and Eastern Europe, through the Balkans into the Anatolian Peninsula, actually perished on the way. And of course, they sacked and attacked many Eastern Christians along the way. I once saw a photo and was giving a talk in Bosnia, and we were talking a little bit about the genocide, and about this, fact that Croatians, had this festival, a local town festival. It was a medieval festival, but they all dressed up as Crusaders, not as what medieval Croats might have been wearing and so on. Their idea was of a Western Crusader as their heritage. And it was so ironic to me because the Crusaders came through that area and absolutely pillaged, killed and so on. But it's part of what you had said before, is that it's a mythological kind of motif of the history that we remember, or that people remember. And so they went on this very long journey that was so devastating that it was seen, and difficult to achieve, that it was seen as suffering that increased the penitential value of the pilgrimage, but also as miraculous that they actually managed to have success during a period when that part of the Muslim world, particularly the Levant, was between and a zone of conflict between two warring polities, one centered in Egypt under the Fatimids, a Shi'i dynasty, versus the Abbasids and the Seljuk Turks, who supported them and ruled as sultans, centered in Persia and Iraq. And so the Levant was a zone of conflict, and there were a lot of small polities kind of in the interstitial spaces. And because of the divided character of it, this band of people half starving, and that's something that was very important in the First Crusade Chronicles, that talk about how hungry and awful it led even to reports of cannibalism, in one of the cities, Al-Ma'ara, where the inhabitants, and Christian, Muslim, it's important to remember during this period that much of Syria and what is today Lebanon and Palestine were actually Christian communities, like of various different Eastern Christian communities, and that it wasn't necessarily, it was much more equal, perhaps you might say. Christians weren't necessarily a minority in much of the territory from Antioch to Jerusalem. And so when they went and they slaughtered many Eastern Christians, as well as, of course, Muslim inhabitants. And at this one place in Ma'ara, they were so exhausted, hungry, and so on, that there were reports of cannibalism taking place. So when they actually finally arrived to Jerusalem and laid siege to the city, for a long period of time without a whole lot of success, and it looked like the whole venture was going to collapse, they did some processions around the city, and then lo and behold, a miracle happened. One part of the wall, somebody was able to scale it, and then they were able to open the gates, and they sacked the city and massacred all of the inhabitants, to the extent that in very apocalyptic language, one of the First Crusade sources talks about how the Dome of the Rock, which they called the Temple of Solomon, they thought, well, even though they should have known in some sense that the whole important, famous point about the diaspora of the Jews, the exile of the Jews, was that the Temple of Solomon was destroyed, but nonetheless there's this beautiful building with a golden dome. They're like, oh, that's the Temple of Solomon, which is why the Templars, the religious military order known as the Templars, they were named after the Temple of Solomon. But this First Crusade source talks about the slaughter, that there were rivers of blood and charnel kind of flowing down. And this is not an apologetic source. This is a celebratory source that seems to suggest that some kind of fulfillment of history was expected, right? So the way to explain this, I think, at least initially, is to say that there were certain religious ideas. There was a tradition of penitential and devotional piety that the geopolitical circumstances, with this ideological kind of set of expectations and motivations, kind of came together in a remarkable success that then validated the whole ideological program. Even if Jesus didn't himself return, there was something to be celebrated about the reconstitution at what was regarded as the center of the world, the beginnings for a new Christian hegemony over the world. And it's very clear that they did not see borders for this polity, but in an early letter sent back to the Pope, they celebrate the conquest of Jerusalem and say that this will be the beginning point for spreading Christian hegemony from sea to sea. Okay, so this universalist kind of doctrine of conquest, starting at the center of the world that's been restored to Christian sovereignty, is going to begin the process for a greater kind of conquest and transformation of the world.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess, I mean, that's a good place to move into our next question, really, which is just to kind of, one of the things that I've heard you talk about a little bit, I think you talked about it on Cena's podcast, was just the material ramifications of this, of the Crusades towards even like an early development of capitalism, or kind of a jumpstart in certain ways, or, even if that's not the right way to frame it, just like, how does this, we can kind of understand how spiritually, ideologically, this might do certain things for the folks who participated in it and for the church and so on. But you see other, ramifications from it from a kind of materialist's level too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very important point to recognize. When I said that it was a series of wars, not just the named Crusades, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth, right? Crusades within the space of 200 years. And I would argue and suggest also that it wasn't just about these big mobilizations that took place with major crusading armies first going overland, but then later spurring, a great deal of maritime and naval investment, which is, I think, very important, if we want to talk about some of the material effects, is the investment in a war economy and military technologies and development is extremely important in the Crusades. Like, it was a way of really mobilizing many more resources because of the unique and authorized and legitimate character of this holy war. So they started going, and putting, money into ship production and shipbuilding and, all the techniques and arts of maritime and naval war and commerce and trade. So it's not a real surprise in some ways that a kind of Keynesian, military Keynesianism, as, Chomsky talks about the United States, that those investments were very important. So there was, for example, just as a contrast, there was an important trading city that almost nobody has heard about in this context. Everyone's heard of Genoa. Everyone's heard of Venice. But there was Amalfi, in the pre-Crusade period in the 10th and earlier 11th century. That was a very successful trading city on the western coast, not so far away from Sicily, but the western coast of the Italian peninsula, that was engaged in a kind of triangle trade because they had good trading relations with port cities in Egypt, and they would take those goods and things that were brought to Egypt from the Indian Ocean trade through the Red Sea or, the Persian Gulf into, the port of Basra and then across. But basically, it was a good entrepreneur for bringing goods from the Middle East and their connections into the Indian Ocean trade and further east to the Byzantines. And so they were involved in this kind of cross-cultural trading between these different societies and cultures. They disappear. And they disappear because they had an investment in peaceful relations and coexistence, whereas their competitors who join in with providing naval and maritime services to the crusading armies in the 12th century, like Genoa and Venice, eclipsed them in their development because they got a massive infusion in investment, in development, and were involved in commerce slash piracy, raiding slash trading, right? Like, so, when we talk about primitive accumulation, this has to be looked at, that the early roots of crusading, even though they didn't work out the mechanisms in the way modern colonialism did so effectively, it's the beginning of a process by which maritime trading and commercial development is enhanced in a particular way. It's not the only way it could have happened, but it's the historical way in which it develops out of warfare and out of taxation. So this is another kind of important, that statecraft is based, and the development of states, according to many political scientists who look at this historically, is that the key functions of a state early on, historically, and you can see this in the Middle East, you can see this in early proto-state development in Europe, from ancient times to the medieval and into the modern and early modern, when the military revolution takes place in the early modern period, is war making and financing the expensive project of war making. Okay, so feudal society, you could mobilize lords who saw themselves as essentially a king's equal. Okay, he had maybe a crown and he'd been anointed, but they, thought he was just primus inter pares, first among equals. And they held their land technically from their lord, their king, and their sublords, to greater lords and so on. But they didn't regard what they paid as tax, because they paid in service. They paid through their military labor. For a season of the year, 40 days, 60 days, conventions would be different. I will serve you as a faithful military vassal, right? And this is how land tenure was organized and how administration of justice took place and so on, is that every lord had their own court for the people who they controlled, right? And so it's this kind of organization. How do you get surplus out of this? You can't. Where do you get the surplus? If you want to make war out of the season when these lords don't want to come and they're always rebelling and pursuing their own interests, you want a dependent military class that you pay for their service, that they will be loyal, but that's so expensive. So one of the ways in which the Crusades really developed kind of war making and thus state making and state building during the medieval period, in this kind of transition from feudal society to a different kind of society, is that the Crusades allowed secular rulers, that is, rulers like kings and lords, to raise taxes for the first time. The church always got its tenth, the tithe. The tithe is a tenth. That was the only institution that was capable of generating revenue through a kind of taxation across the Latin West. What starts to happen is something like the crisis, the military crisis, the spiritual crisis of losing Jerusalem, for example, to Saladin, that needed the Third Crusade, led to a special extraordinary income tax that was allowed to be levied to the kings of France and of England. And in England, they called it the Saladin tithe. So they named the tax for the enemy that we had to fight. And so what you have is the process by which new ways of raising revenue, of organizing society, are being established in a material way because of the extraordinary and spiritually authorized form of warfare that was papally approved and papally sponsored and organized and could be used by lords to pursue their own kind of territorial and state-making interests. So you have basically statecraft is changing, and you can look and see that even when you think of the organization of the Latin West as a whole, the most important council is Lateran IV. And sometimes people say this is really the development of a kind of Christian society, because why? It was the first time where people were required, Christians were required to attend Mass once a year and give confession once a year, okay, and for forgiveness of their sins, and then do their penance. And you might say, well, okay, what did it mean to be a Christian if you didn't have to minimally do that? And many were, of course, doing that, but society was divided around those who fight, those who pray, and those who work, those who labor. The peasants who produced, the surplus to support this military class who fought and supported the monasteries. So one segment of the society was just dedicated to prayer. They were the religious. What starts to happen in the late 12th and into the 13th century is the idea that we need to expand Christian society to all sectors of these people. And one of the kind of impulses or impetus behind this was we need to reform society because we keep losing these wars in the Crusades. And so we have to purge the sinful, the heretical. And so you see that the same injunctions that establish every Christian's obligations, in 1215 in Lateran IV, are also putting in injunctions about the suppression of heresy. And Lateran IV was itself a crusade organizing council. It was a universal council sponsored by Innocent III to do a few things, all for the purpose of trying to reform Christian society, trying to kind of suppress and purify it, and to enlist, the common everyday person into the project of a Christian society, to pray, for success, and to organize a universal crusade council so that this time, hopefully, they would be victorious in 1215. So a lot of developments that we would call material developments in the organization of society, in the organization of states, in the investment in military technology and shipbuilding that ends up giving, Genoa and Venice predominance over the Mediterranean Sea. These kinds of things, it seems to me, are closely connected to the project of crusade and crusading. And I think the other kind of important point, and we could talk a little bit more about this, is how the kind of crusade, commerce, and colonial context of the Mediterranean, the Genoese are the biggest slavers in the world. Is it any, during this period, is it any, and 40%, it's thought like in 1300s that, 1300s, 1400s, that 40% of Genoa's population, a republic, mind you, was enslaved peoples. Okay, obviously disenfranchised, and they couldn't vote, and they couldn't participate in political society. They weren't citizens, etc. But there was a massive underclass. The Genoese had huge networks to the Black Sea to connect parts of Central Asia, into North Africa. They were constantly involved in, attacks on or seeking trading concessions with, powers in North Africa, modern day Tunisia and Algeria and so forth. And so, they get this competitive advantage because they're part of the crusading project. And what they're interested in doing in many cases in territories that they conquer throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, with the Fourth Crusade, most of the Eastern Mediterranean's northern part, the Byzantine Empire, becomes a Latin empire because the Fourth Crusade, instead of going to, Palestine, ends up under Venetian interest and guidance, sacking Constantinople and installing a Latin crusader as its emperor for, until about, I think it's 1203 to 1260. So you've got this period where they're colonizing and settling and conquering and Eastern Mediterranean societies, and in places like Cyprus, trying to establish, as they did in Palestine, trying to establish plantations for sugar plantations. They're attempting to do that. So when we look at like the history of the Atlantic world, and we say, oh, this is modernity, this is some new thing. Yes, there were many new features, and the success of it is what's important, to my mind, more than it is the actual plans and techniques of what they were doing, which was in the Mediterranean. They were trying to essentially have enslaved labor work plantations to produce sugar. They were interested in trying to get into the Red Sea. There were attempts to put galleys in the Red Sea in order to short circuit, the land, trade routes and networks, and to displace those. This is why the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart, seemed more interested in trying to conquer Egypt than he was in trying to lay siege to Jerusalem. something that, even his army was sometimes a little upset with him. The Fourth Crusade was meant to go to Egypt, but they went off the rails and went to a different node in the major trade route zone Venice is concerned, being Black Sea trade through Constantinople back into the Mediterranean. Why the Fifth Crusade, the one organized in 1215 by Innocent III at the Lateran IV Council, attacks and invades Egypt. Why Louis IX, St. Louis is named after him, and you can see a great crusader, sculpture of him there, attacks Egypt. It's like, okay, so Jerusalem was this goal of pious pilgrimage, but very quickly it becomes a geostrategic and commercial object to control trading routes into the Indian Ocean. And so the coast of coast of Egypt is the first point at which then we might be able to go further south and get into the Red Sea. So it seems to me that that project of what's happening in the Mediterranean is what motivates the move into the Atlantic. They're blocked, in the Crusade. After 1291, they never, have this opportunity until, George Allenby, during the Mandate period, the British, general, to take Jerusalem and this territory, or under Cromer, you could say Egypt was under. So what do? They go around the coast of Africa. The Portuguese are the first to do so. But what they're attempting to do is connect to trade in the Indian Ocean on their own terms. And so it seems to me that if you want to do a history of capitalism and of the transformation, and particularly the importance of the Atlantic world as a new system, that is a world system that transforms with settler colonial, plantation economy, and so on, you can't ignore the earlier roots where these experiments and techniques are being worked out. Christopher Columbus is hired by Ferdinand and Isabella to spearhead their Atlantic empire for a good reason, is because he and his forebears for several hundred years had been working in the Mediterranean to perfect the enslavement, conquest, and commerce complex.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you. Along the way there, I had a Sheriff of Nottingham joke to make, but we got too far away from the taxation thing to make it. But yeah, I mean, no, that's great, Adnan. And let's so then I guess from there too, one of the things I forgot to ask you about is this notion of Christendom, and like, how does this talk about this in terms of kind of congealing some of these disparate forces, or what is the impact of this in Europe in terms of a unifying, I guess, period?
Yes. I think basically following some great scholarship that's looked at, this guy, Thomas Maschnock, wrote a great book called Crusading Peace. And it's really about Western political order and how the Crusades were important in it. He's the first scholar. He's doing more of a kind of intellectual history and ideas and church sorts of things. And he doesn't really study Crusades and crusading itself, but he's very interested in the ideological consequences of the crusading movement and what I would call a crusading society. And he essentially suggests that the first real concept of Christendom that had major purchase, and where there's really an interest in thinking about it and discussing it, is really coterminous with the Crusade movement. And it's, it's hard to say which is first, which is a cause, which is a consequence, and all that, but they're clearly very connected. And I would argue that you could even suggest that, what does it mean to be part of Christendom? I would suggest that, of course, there are certain formal and technical dimensions. You have to be Catholic. You have to recognize the Pope as the supreme pontiff. You have to regard your political leadership as somehow legitimately authorized by papal approbation or investiture and so forth. That's certainly, then you are part of a community of polities that sees itself as part of a similar kind of over large-scale polity. But what I would argue is that it also meant the lands in which the crusade is being preached, and where this mobilization can take place, that you see your loyalty to a polity that is involved in a kind of war with the Saracens. And you can see that there are early, like in Scandinavia, right after the First Crusade, Sigurd of Norway, Sigurd the First, I can't remember how recently he'd become a Christian, but this is a new Christian land, right? This is a dynasty that's new in terms of being Christian kings and so on. He immediately goes on crusade to follow up the success of the First Crusade. And it's a way of indicating you are part of this Western alliance. You are part of Christendom, is to go on crusade and to regard crusading as a kind of not only legitimate, but maybe even necessary obligation of the political and military class. Think of it from, I don't want to be too crude, but think of it as NATO. It is participating in NATO. It's like the military alliance that sees the war to secure Jerusalem and the Holy Land as one of the key kinds of constituent obligations of the political and military class. So this idea of Christendom is, I think, very important. It's the precursor to Europe. It's a precursor to the West. The West, what is the West? The West is really Latin, is really Western Europe with its successful settler colonial societies. Like South Africa was part of the West when it was an apartheid state. The West, it can include Latin and South America if they identify in a kind of way. If you're Argentina and you've managed to genocide and kill all of your indigenous people and ethnically cleanse the settler colonial society, you may be able to be part of the West. Whereas other parts, parts where there's still a huge indigenous presence, or where there is African descent, formerly enslaved population that dominates, and especially if they come to political power, I would argue in some ways it is no longer the West. It's seen as a problem. It's seen as out of the Western alliance, as following different trajectories and paradigms and alliances. So really the West, you could say, is the crusading Europe and its successful crusading and crusader settler colonies that managed to wipe out the indigenous population. And so I think this concept of Christendom is very important if we look at contemporary far-right ideology and identification, and what is the Christian identity movement. I mean, it's essentially, let's empty out the theology, because that's not really that important. But we need this kind of identity that's been created and forged as a surviving kind of nationalistic, civilizational idea that is in search of a territory and a polity to actually recognize it and inculcate it. So I think, Christendom is actually a very useful concept that comes out of this earlier history, and that we think of Europe and we think of secularization as somehow changing everything, when in fact the actual structures and the geographies continue on, even if there have been certain kinds of ideological changes. There's I would argue, a deeper ideology that is consistent, a deeper set of practices and structures that maintain themselves over a long durée of other kinds of historical change that you can always rely upon, as a solid grounding, particularly for, right-wing, kinds of identitarian, white supremacist, or white nationalist orientations. They're the ones who are the first adopters of the crusade as mythology that they want to identify with. But what I would argue is that colonialism and that whole history, its rationale coming in civilizational or racial superiority, is just the secularization or the biologization of a crusading motif, of a crusading ideology. That changes. So, for example, like if you look at Spain, the history of Spain, very important case. When did Spain become part of the West? Like for 800 years, it had like a lot of Muslims, a lot of Jews. It really, after this Reconquista, which is, one way that this is framed, another way is to say that it's a crusading society locally within the Iberian Peninsula that sees this as a priority to fight the Saracen and to purge the Jew, since you have them at hand, whereas for other parts of Latin Christendom, it is to go, to Jerusalem, that, when they conquered these areas, and I mentioned the 1215 injunctions about, against sexual contact between Christians and non-Christians that include Jews and Saracens, that there were some big defeats of the Muslim polities. The political and military class were defeated, the Almohads, by a crusading papal legate, Cardinal Jimenez de Rada, at Las Navas de Tolosa, but it led to a problem. They defeated the political class. They were now conquered all this territory in the south, in Valencia, in the south, in central parts of the Iberian Peninsula. But now they had huge Muslim populations. They had large Jewish but huge Muslim populations. Valencia was majority Muslim. Okay, the province, it was called the Kingdom of Valencia at the time. Valencia was majority Muslim, even if the city was Christianized and, Jews and Muslims weren't allowed to dwell in the city. It was an exclusive Christian city, much as Jerusalem had been, before the Muslim conquest. But the majority in the countryside until the 1500s was majority, Muslim or Morisco, that is forcibly Christianized, but still, it seems adhering to, some form of Islam that might have been a syncretic form, and so forth, which made them heretics now. Okay, so then they were subject to the surveillance society of the Inquisition, torture and surveillance. But so there's a long history, where Spain, was a very mixed society, and it only becomes a kind of Catholic society once they have forcibly converted or expelled the Jews. And when they have forcibly converted, and then they even expelled the forcibly converted Muslims, okay, the Morisco community, the descendants of those who had been forcibly converted to Christianity, they were expelled. Why? Why were they expelled? It's because what happened is that the zone of difference that had been originally so important, which was religion, religious identity as the difference, migrated into cultural differences. They're speaking Arabic. They won't assimilate. They, women are wearing face covering or head covering. They're going to the hammam, the sort of kind of communal bath. Women are wearing henna on their, the decoration on. They're listening to a certain kind of music called the zarfa, which is a Berber style. They're not like us. So they're Christian now, but they're not good Christians. They might be heretical, and they have a culture that cannot be tolerated because there's cultural difference. And then what happens beyond that is that difference migrates from just these cultural differences into purity of blood legislation. You're not, social distinction now is on whether you descend genealogically from an old Christian family, i.e., you were never tainted by Islam or Judaism. You were never a Jew in your ancestry. You were pure Christian. This is just a short step from the racism and the biologization of identity that is so much a feature of Western colonial ideology and hegemony that establishes white supremacy. So I think from the very beginning, you have to look at the crusading movement as authorizing a certain kind of Christian supremacy that was a culturalist supremacy of Western Christian identity. It creates it as a kind of ethnic identity that is exclusive and different. And even if you convert to Christianity, you're still not acceptable. And that, to me, is where the exclusivism translates so seamlessly then into a different rationale, where it's made into a ideology of scientific racism and authorizes white supremacy during the colonial era and into our own. So this idea of Christendom as the true homeland, right, you might say, of the Latin West, of the Western Christian. And it doesn't matter, with the changes in history in the early modern period, with the Reformation, Protestantism as horrible and the wars of religion were really awful. But nonetheless, in the end, what supersedes it is an idea that you're still part of Christendom. It may be translated. Maybe that's why they had to invent whiteness, to resolve the religious differences. And of course, there were nationalist ideologies that, produced more wars. But ultimately, the wars within Europe were, I think, and they've of course been historiographically over exaggerated in Western Eurocentric narratives of politics and war and conflict. But those pale in comparison with the importance and the significance of Europe and whiteness vis-a-vis the colonies and the darker, as Vijay Prashad would say, the darker nations and the darker peoples of the world.
Yeah, thank you for all that. I want to go back a little bit later. We want to get to settler colonialism a little bit more and talk about that, because I think, obviously one of the things that's interesting is just that they did these crusades in established states, right? Like the idea of like, we want these crusader states. But the place I kind of want to go next is just that when we do, watch, I don't know, a BBC documentary or History Channel or something like that on the Crusades, what we largely get is some version of the European story, some version of, maybe it includes, Saladin, and like it includes some of these, important generals or leaders, right, within the armies that the Crusaders were fighting. But it's largely a story about Europe. And obviously we've talked a lot about how this all impacted Europe and what it means, I'm using Europe loosely here, understanding that Europe wasn't really a thing at this time, but obviously it does have this long-term impact. But what I'm thinking about is also that we don't hear very much of the perspective of the peoples that were there, that were being crusaded against, and how societies in the region responded. What kinds of, obviously there were some divisions between different, they could be warring with each other and so on, and right, so then there was some unification that happened in certain ways in response to this as well. But I'm interested in that, in sort of like what kind of, obviously you have these military invasions, you have people who march for hundreds, if not 1,000+ miles to, come to your lands and, commit horrific slaughters and, lay siege to your cities so that, people are, starving as they have these armies surrounding their cities and so on. And so I'm just curious from your perspective, what you think some of the material and ideological legacies of that are for Muslims, for Arabs, for people in the region, and I mean, obviously, as you said, like the region is also fairly diverse at this time. It's not just a monolithic society that's being invaded either.
Yeah, that's right. It is a very diverse region. It may be ruled principally by Muslims, who may incorporate different religious communities in various aspects of their court administration and so forth. But it is a Muslim polity, a Muslim-led polity. But the actual societies are very diverse, with many different kinds of Christians, actually several different kinds of Jewish communities. Karaite versus Rabbinite Jews, and there's just a lot of ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity in these very cosmopolitan parts of the old world. That is the Middle East, you could say, is this intermediate region. It's a crossroads, and as a result, it has been, along many different trade routes, and that has brought a kind of cosmopolitan diversity to the kinds of groups and communities and the influences that it can, in its art, and in even something that's like pottery is that there's like a lot of adoption of Chinese techniques of glaze pottery, and so it is a very kind of cosmopolitan place that's along these trade routes, and I think, to be honest, that the Crusades had a negative effect on what we might call Islamicate governance over, and broadly speaking, a kind of toleration of religious communities as having autonomy in their own religious spheres, their own religious leadership, and their own governance within, as long as they paid a kind of special tax. They were to be excluded from the very highest echelons, like a ruling dynast that wasn't going to be tolerated or accepted, but they could, be in the administration and so forth. And they were also not isolated in religious minorities like Jews and Christians, were not isolated from the economy, in the sense that you have trading communities. There's a very famous Jewish diasporic trading network, that these wonderful documents that have been preserved in what's called the Geniza collection, that is the Egyptian Cairene cellar, where documents that had the name of God on it were disposed of, because you had to be careful in disposing them. And so this cellar where they dumped a lot of documents was kind of covered over and then discovered in the 19th century, and was a treasure trove of bills of sale, of letters, of treatises, of all kinds of different communications, because they all had the name of God on them. They were preserved, and they show that there was a very geographically dispersed but interconnected Jewish trading diaspora operating across the Mediterranean, North Africa, into Spain, to the Indian Ocean, with outposts in India, right? So this means that there was the possibility of these groups and communities creating trust networks that allowed them to flourish economically, whereas in Europe, during this period of the 12th and 13th century, Jews, for example, rather classically, are pushed into either small-scale peddlers, traveling itinerant peddlers, or into money lending and usury, a hated kind of profession, and that they were not able to be incorporated in different aspects of labor, in the market, in the economy, because to be part of a guild, for example, you had to be a Christian. It doesn't say you have to be a Christian, but you have to be part of a confraternity. You have to take an oath. These are all Christian mechanisms. And so there was de facto a kind of exclusion. That's not happening during this period in Islamic societies, but with the resulting kind of period of 200 years of ceaseless mobilizations and people coming. And I wanted to say that there may be those named big military crusades that we hear about in the history books, but really anybody going on pilgrimage during this time might go with a band of 30 or 40 people, and decide, okay, we'll stay for some months, because of course it wasn't like travel is now. You go and you come back, you hop on a plane, it takes months and months. And there's certain seasons when the Mediterranean, given the level of technology of maritime, sails and galley, sometimes it wasn't really very navigable. So the fall, there are storms, you need to get there before then, or leave there before then, if you want to be there in time for Easter and the services of culminating the pilgrimage and so on. So people stayed months And what they would do sometimes is, well, they will, help the Crusader states, right? Help reinforce them or fight or do things. And so what you have is kind of ceaseless periods where there's mobilization, there's migration and movement, constantly attempting to expand these territories or shore them up and so on. And initially, the Muslims, when they, faced and confronted this band of Crusaders coming overland, starving and exhausted, they just sort of regarded them as this kind of somewhat barbaric people, like any other barbaric group of invaders. But soon they began to recognize and appreciate that they were motivated and organized by a particular religious ideology of holy war and crusading. That despite the fact that the Crusaders also oppressed a lot of the Eastern Christians, they saw them as their natural allies and also regarded them as a safer community, to have in their domestic sphere, to do business with and so forth. And so they privileged some of the links in local society were with Eastern Christians, particularly Greek Orthodox, that had a lot of, religious compatibility. There were tensions, but they were closer than some of the other Eastern Christian communities. And as a result, I think this started to change the dynamic and relations of tolerance, particularly in Egypt, the Levant, and so on. And we see by the 13th and 14th century that there are harsher policies that try to isolate and marginalize communities that have been seen as co-confessionalists to this invading settler colonial community. And I think that has some negative effects. One of the other effects is that the call for unity among Muslims started to take shape of a revival of holy war, or jihad discussion. New treatises are written to say, hey, jihad is very important and we need to do it because they have a religious ideology that we need to combat. And so you see, for example, in the accounts of Salah ad-Din, there's a great source, Baha'u'ddin ibn Shaddad's sort of biography about Salah ad-Din. He was a close kind of judicial official in his administration and accompanied him on many of these wars, and certainly through some of the important early successful ones in the recapture of Jerusalem and so forth. He characterizes Salah ad-Din as a holy warrior, right? As somebody who's very dedicated to it, who loves religion, loves to surround himself with religious scholars and to patronize religious study and so on. And there's even one report, for example, that he had hadith or pious sayings of the Prophet Muhammad read out to his arrayed army before a certain battle. And what you see, these are innovative new developments that are taking place in the political and military and religious culture that are seen as necessary to mobilize the kind of fervor of these, warriors who are shouting Deus Levolt, God wills it, and doing these processions with, holy relics and so on, that in order to counter it, you see matching a rise in religiously motivated and characterized forms of military response. And so I think if you wanted to look at, broadly material kinds of questions, you would say that overall, in some ways, the Crusades didn't end up changing that much because they were defeated after 200 years. It was smaller scale in that it was relatively contained in the Levant and sometimes in Egypt. And that there's a famous historian, Ibn al-Athir, who writes a multi-volume world historical chronicle. And his preface to the volume that deals with the 12th and 13th centuries in the Middle East is a kind of wider scope look at the region, where he says, we were beset on two fronts during this time. We had the Franks, that is how they characterized the Latins, the Latin Crusaders. We had the Ifranj, the Franks, invading Egypt and the Levant constantly over and over, and we had to, dedicate so much to try and preserve the holy places, Jerusalem, protect like the Hejaz from, these incursions. But the really devastating, calamitous blow was the Mongols. That was a devastating, kind of invasion that wiped out cities, that, was much more serious. And, it ends with in the early 14th century with the Mongol lords ruling what it was called the Ilkhanate, that is the lands of like Persia, Iraq, and so forth, ended up converting to Islam. But at the time that he was writing, it seemed like that was the much bigger and more devastating and consequential challenge that they were facing. The Franks was a persistent problem for 2 centuries. And of course, it would have all kinds of local effects, everything from military techniques and technology to, social changes in the region, including perhaps increased hostility towards Christian co-confessionalists, and, less, seeing them as a potential fifth column, in the same way that Muslims in Iberia were seen as a fifth column, potentially as allies of, the Ottomans, during the era of Habsburg control over Spain. So you had these dynamics that certainly affected social and religious and cultural relations. But overall, because they managed to defeat the Crusaders, the more consequential component perhaps was that the Portuguese and the Spanish go into the Atlantic, and different opportunities and world historical changes result, as a result, you might say, of Muslim resistance, right? Of their resistance to the Crusades. It ended up pushing a different historical trajectory, in global historical terms.
That's great. That's I think an important point to make. I remember one of the like bad documentaries I was watching on this did say, like, after the first crusade that like it didn't even it barely registered for like Muslim society, kind of like they didn't really, you know, because it just wasn't, it's this band of people that come in and they try to do something, and they like, you know, but it makes sense if you're fighting, more advanced armies and things like this, that it might, it might not. And then, but it was the kind of constant that they kept coming.
Yeah,
for
and
over
that the
this 200 period.
legacy the
Yeah.
legacy is that, of course, that can be a touchstone for the era of colonialism, right?
Right.
Where you really are subjected to massive intervention and disruption of your entire society through colonial control, even if it's not settler colonialism across most of the Middle East and India, parts of Africa, but of course also importantly settler colonialism in North Africa, which was often seen as French dominion in North Africa was often framed around, well, Louis IX came here and he died there, in Tunis on crusade, and this is kind of a resumption of that, or Napoleon's, kind of invasion of Egypt, and so on. But the Crusades were very important in the Middle East for thinking about anti-colonial resistance. And so, of course, somebody like Salah ad-Din becomes a figure around which anti-colonial legacies can attach themselves. And I think in some ways that's had an enduring relevance, you might say, in the contemporary. Perhaps we'll talk about it.
Yeah.
There were Crusader states then, and many argue and characterize Crusader states existing in broadly the same territories today.
Yeah. We'll go there in a second. Let's first, I have 2 more things, and then I know there's some audience questions. We'll try to get to a couple of those at least.
Oh,
But,
great.
so let's talk about settler colonialism, because obviously this comes, you kind of have laid out through this discussion, the development of these kind of, certain mercantile city states that become important. You've talked about the resistance that folks faced in this region. I also just found it interesting just that they sought to establish
Mhm.
settler, Crusader states, as they called them, in this area through these crusades, that was the idea, and obviously, they would think of it as a recapturing basically of something that had been lost from them, is sort of the way that they framed it, right? Because this was Jesus's land basically,
Right.
and their the ideology that's being promoted among these holy warriors. And I think your point on jihad was really important too, because that is another thing, is that, you know, I mean, they were warriors, the Christian warriors, the Crusaders were engaged in holy war and understood it that way and fought certain ways because of that too. The part of the brutality and um the violence that they undertook was also an understanding that this was God's will too, to kind of be this brutal. And so just in listening to that, listening to your conversation with Sina, I couldn't help but think about, yeah, this is an important story as we start to get to European settler colonial projects. And so, yeah, anything that you wanted to offer around that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's one of the most important contemporary legacies, for obvious reasons, of the Crusades is the formation of these polities in the Levant. We refer to them as the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader states, the Latin Crusader states. And those were, in really, I think, profound ways, the first attempt at larger scale overseas, like non-contiguous, just conquering bordering lands, but overseas conquest and establishing of settler colonies that required not only a kind of very serious organizing and integrating ideology to justify it that bases itself on historical legitimacy and precedent, and there were more than one vectors for that. Well, of course, it was Jesus's land, but it was also seen as, the territories of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had conquered these areas. They had recently been, in a few hundred years earlier, had been part of the Eastern Roman Empire's important lands. Jerusalem had been an important Christian city in the Eastern Roman Empire, in which non-Christians, particularly Jews in this case, were not allowed to settle and spend time until the Arab-Muslim conquest restored in a more obvious and open, kind of normal way, Jewish communities back into Jerusalem. And so that legacy was also something that was looked at, that the Holy Roman Emperor, for example, of Germany, a title that had been first established basically for Charlemagne when the popes crown him an emperor. These subsequent rulers of Germany and parts of Italy saw themselves as inheritors of the Roman Empire, the Roman Imperium, and that they had title in some sense to these lands because they'd been part of the Roman Empire. So you have a kind of religious and imperial territorial kind of justification for a prior historical claim to the land. And that's, of course, very similar to using ancient history for a new settler colonial project. I mean, so we have things that are similar. I would argue that in some ways, this is the first attempt, as I was saying, at an experiment in settler colonialism that has similarities with the most recent settler colony established, which is, of course, Israel. We hope it will be the last such, and I've tweeted recently about there's a question, will Israel last as long as the Crusader states? This is a kind of a question. It's been 80 plus years or so. How long is it going to continue? But what's interesting about the Latin Crusader states and Israel is that they're different from many of the settler colonies and other colonial possessions in what we might think of as the classic or high point of colonialism in the 19th and early 20th century, that were sponsored by nation states, right? European nation states that conquered territories, ruled and administered them. Sometimes they call themselves empires, but I don't think they really are empires in the older understanding and definition of these multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-religious polities of the old world, like either the Achaemenid Empire, the Sasanian empires in Persia, or the Russian Empire, under the Tsars, or the Abbasid Empire, the, kind of largest, contiguous land empire before the Mongol empires in the world that ruled from North Africa, Morocco, basically, to parts of Central Asia. So many different communities and peoples and languages were organized under one kind of dominant dynasty, but there wasn't a kind of ethno-national restriction on participation in the polity, right? If you were a talented person who, was a great doctor, a medical doctor, and there were so many Jewish doctors, like Maimonides' son seems to have been, or Maimonides himself seems to have been a doctor in the court of an Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt. You could, participate at that level. Whereas these nation states that colonize others created an exclusive group that had rights within society, and the others who had no rights. And there was no way, if you were an Indian from the subcontinent, that you could become somebody at the colonial metropole as an incorporated member. You couldn't, like, say, run for parliament or serve in the British administration in London, right? It's just not possible. So that's something that's different. They often talk about the British Empire. It certainly wasn't run along the kind of ideas of cosmopolitan empires of the old or ancient world. So these colonizing nation states, they were particular sponsors of settler and colonial possessions. Whereas what we've noticed, first, the Crusades were a kind of pan-European, pan-Christendom project. It was the frontier state and outpost of Christendom, of the West, essentially. And that's what we see with Israel, that it presents itself ideologically as a frontier state facing the Saracens, except that, they're not called Saracens anymore, but it's basically the same thing. That, when Netanyahu comes to sell his project and why it should be supported across the West, which is what's been amazing to see, is the way in which it is a collective project of the West. It's not sponsored by a particular nation, of Germany or, the UK or the United States, but it is a collective expression of the political ambitions, the imperial ambitions of the West as a whole. And that's very similar to the Crusader states. So the first Crusade project, and what I would argue in some ways the last Crusade type project that we've witnessed, are similarly expressions of Western political ambitions to hegemony in the region. So the other ways in which they're very similar to settler colonies that we would be familiar with is the way in which there is a genocidal approach towards indigenous peoples. The difference is, I would argue, the difference simply is that genocide as a Western value wasn't a realistic prospect in the era of medieval forms of organization, techniques of warfare, and so on. And the population of the Crusaders was, the Franks and the settlers, was very small in comparison with the indigenous population. And they just didn't have the techniques, and they didn't have the labor, right, to be able to completely displace the indigenous populations and genocide them. When they come to the New World, they're more successful at doing that in certain parts of the New World. But it's clearly a goal. And you can see that, I would argue, in the way in which massacres, wholesale massacre of populations in the contained environments of the urban setting, did take place. Like, you may not be able to go out into the countryside and evacuate all of those people. In fact, you actually need them to grow crops and so on. But in the urban spaces in which this society builds its culture, its institutions, its polities, its political arrangements, its political center, and so on, there were many cases where the indigenous population, both Christian and Muslim and Jewish, for example, in Jerusalem, were totally liquidated. And that genocidal orientation is something that we can see being more fully realized in classic colonialism and in, the current, crusading state, you might say. So those are, some features that connect these two cases of settler colonialism. And what I would argue is that the Crusade is the early experiments and attempts to do this. The economic basis was meant to be, if possible, enslavement of conquered populations, or at least purchasing and trading in slaves, on plantation style ventures to cultivate certain kind of cash crops and to process them locally. They took over sort of soap production, sort of factories and so on. And so there was this kind of, through conquest, trying to appropriate, you could say, the wealth, the industrial techniques, and the labor of the indigenous societies that they conquered, in much the same way that will be experimented and more fully realized, as I've already mentioned, in the Atlantic world, much more successfully.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we kind of melded my last two questions together there, so I think that's basically it. Unless there's anything else that you wanted to say about thinking about this legacy with the war that that we've been dealing with for the last 18 months.
Well, it is almost a stereotype of, say, Arab historiography to talk about Zionists as crusaders, right? It's almost a truism. And yet this is so delegitimized in Western discourse, about the state of Israel and its policies and treatment of indigenous Palestinian populations, that it's worth just underscoring how similar it is in many ways. Of course, it's a modern state that's developed. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same as like these Crusader states. I mean, mutatis mutandis. There's so much that's changed and different in the kind of global context and history and what's happened. But there's something very important about its role in the Western imagination that is not just about the biblical narratives. And I think that's what's important to recognize, that of course there is that layer there of the way in which Protestantism kind of reversed, you might say, the Crusades, where the Crusades were this kind of odd departure in a way of materializing and territorializing this claim to Holy Jerusalem, and putting the Franks in the place of the Hebrews, you might say, replacing them, or they're the ones that the story is really about them actually enacting this in history. And that what happened in Protestant changes is that because of course you have to recognize, and we can read Ilan Pape's book that summarizes some of this earlier scholarship quite well, is that the first Zionists were Christians. Okay, they're the ones who really get the Zionist project going, and their apocalyptic imagination differed from the Catholic apocalyptic scenarios about the return of Christ, that Christians will reconstitute the Jerusalem in which Christ will come back. Their apocalyptic solution to the problem of Jewish persistence after the Second Temple in the era of Christian salvation, that should mean that they should recognize that, that's all over. Christ has come, their Messiah has come, and that they mistook and misunderstood this in salvation history. That their solution to it is that the Jews will reconstitute a Jewish kingdom as a precursor to the ultimate solution and culmination of history that results in Christ's return and the elimination of Jewish difference in history. That, you know, they'll either convert or they'll be killed, and that's the solution to the Jewish question, right? For these, and that it solves, that Zionism solved in some ways the problems of the Jewish question, because, and this is why so many of the far right are avid Zionists, is because you get them out of Europe, get them out of the West, they can transform and become the West as a settler colonial state, as perpetrators of colonial genocide. Then they become Westerners, they become Crusaders. Because the foundation of Western identity, I'm arguing, is the crusading society and is the operating of crusade, you know, in history. And so they can now be the protagonists of salvation scenario at the end of time by, you know, becoming Westerners, by fighting the Saracen and on behalf of Western Christendom, and transform themselves in the process. And so there are such continuities, you have to say, even though it may take on, in its initial stages, it was seen as a secular ideology. It was displacing Jewish messianism with the building of a state. But that state itself inhabits the position of a messianic culmination of history, both for the Christian Zionists and, you know, you could say for Jewish nationalists and ultimately Jewish supremacists. So I think this crusade history is actually very illuminating, not because there's a one-to-one relationship or some kind of straight line, but that the way in which there's been a perduring of certain structural orientations and predispositions is the only way, it seems to me, to explain how it is that you can have the end of international law, a technique the colonial West created to help manage the global South and the rest of the world, but they're willing to sacrifice that. They're willing to sacrifice all kinds of other Enlightenment and liberal and humanistic values, almost exclusively, almost totally, in their uniformity, with rare dissidents, and the, you know, puzzling questions. Why is that the case? How could that be the case? And what I would argue is that it's because it really participates in a much longer historical trajectory that can be understood through really recognizing that the West has been a crusading society, and its value of genocide is something to which it is deeply attached.
Thank you, Adnan. This has been great. And I'm just going to share a few comments, and then there's a couple of questions that we can take from the chat if you have a little bit of time.
Sure.
So one is just, this is where the whole Western narrative about this being a fight of civilizations comes from. Yeah, I mean, that's I can't remember, is it Bernard Henry Levy, the French philosopher or whatever, he has this whole thing that he goes on about, like, why this is so important to support the state of Israel, because this is a civilizational fight, you know.
And he'll do so in very secular terms, right? Like, you don't have to think of the Crusades as just theological holy war. I mean, that's its roots, of course, but you can secularize it and still have the same kind of narrative, just substitute other things, and it amounts to something very similar. So I think that's a good point, is to recognize that the civilizational discourse is just a more cultural, secular, academic sounding way of talking about something fairly similar.
Yeah, thank you. This question, curious about how Western Christianity, Latin West, positioned itself in relation to Eastern Christianity, and how the Crusaders still killed Eastern Christians. This was earlier in the conversation, so it was also before you also talked about that piece of, they also, you know, the Christians that were in the Levant were still the closest thing that they might have to allies in some sense, but there was also this legacy as well. So I don't know if you want to speak to this at all.
The only thing to say here is just that they had, conflicted relations with Eastern Christians. On the one hand, they were part of the justification that out of caritas, charity, love of thy neighbor, the idea that they were Christian brothers, brethren, that were suffering under the yoke of pagan, Saracen, oppressive rule. And if you read like the sermons of Urban II, it's full of like lurid sort of details of macabre violence, of how Christian, boys were being circumcised, and then the blood of their circumcision was being used to pollute the holy altars. So this kind of blood piety, on the holy altars is supposed to be the body and blood of Christ, not this like pagan circumcision, and if you go back to Paul, of course, that, Christianity is sort of, we reject circumcision of the body for circumcision of the spirit, right? Paul says, no, you don't have to follow those, disgusting rituals. You can just, be circumscribed in your spirit. That means purified in your spirit, right? So, this kind of like motif was just scandalizing people. And there was this sense that we have to intervene to help them because we actually are brothers, because we partake in the body and blood of Christ, the same rituals. They perform the same rituals that we do in Mass. And this makes us brothers because we are all part of the body of Christ and the blood. We share the blood of Christ. And I would argue this is like early kind of ethnicization, or almost biologization of, a religious identity into something that's deeper. It has sort of roots of, whiteness, like whiteness is Christianness, essentially, in this. So of course that was deeply important. It was a rationale, but in the practical terms, even though they might be closer, sometimes there is a narcissism of small differences. And, they were also the Crusaders were quite disappointed that the Eastern Christians were not a martial race, right? Okay, if you want to put it in, and these ideas of martial peoples and martial races, that is really important in colonial ideology, like under the British in the 19th and century and so on, are things that, again, I think have a little bit of their roots that they're not seen as like vigorous and martial and active the way the Latins, the Franks are. And so they were sometimes quite disappointed by the fact that the Eastern Christians didn't, rebel, take up arms, and, fill their armies. That would have, of course, changed the strategic and military calculus if the indigenous populations of Palestine and the Levant, which in many places was still majority Christian. In certain pockets, you look in the Galilee and places like that, and even to this day, there were areas that were majority Christian in South Lebanon and so on. That it would have changed everything if they actually weren't so bigoted and supremacist, the Latins, that they actually could have recruited the Easterners, but they were constantly being disappointed by them and regarded them as feminized and not as masculine, not as active and warrior. So these are the kinds of relations that they had with the Eastern Christians.
Oh man, the alpha discourse goes all the way back to the
Hey,
Crusades,
Pete
huh?
Hegseth, Christian warrior. It's and that's the important and interesting thing, that we hadn't even talked about. We talked about the far right, but like this embrace of, crusading, and it's tied so closely with this patriarchal masculinist. We're back in the 19th century with so many of the ideas and the metaphors and the way that people are talking about politics now, from the revival of the Monroe Doctrine. We'll concentrate on our hemisphere, Panama, Greenland, Canada belongs to us. It's like we're rerunning, the worst aspects of like late 19th century racialization discourse, supremacy, colonialism, and so on. So,
yeah, I mean, when you talked about that set, the whatever it was, 7 to 9 civilizations or whatever, I couldn't help. We recently did Forgeries of Memory and Meaning by Cedric Robinson, and he has all this stuff about the world's fairs
oh
and
yeah,
how, that's how they were organized, is
that's
like, come
right.
see all the civilizations of the world, and we're gonna put them in a hierarchy based on how literate they are, and da da da.
Mhm.
It was just like, yeah. So anyway,
That's right.
um, all right. Francis has a a 3-comment long question that I'm gonna try to pose to you. Shout out to Frances, she's a good friend of the pod.
Oh, yes.
A present civilizations question. In contrast to Edward Said's argument that cultures and civilizations are dynamic and relational, there's a rise of quote unquote Eastern civilizational arguments that rely on revanchist, atavistic, and conservative points of view, especially on family, gender, and sexuality. This is taking Christian, Russian, Russia, Hungary, Poland, and Muslim forms, less so China, where there's no call to find and reconstruct an idealized past.
Hmm.
We have reactionary civilizational responses grounded in patriarchal culture idioms committed to insular and ahistorical logics. In any thoughts on this?
Well, a really interesting observation and set of connections. It just reminds me, Francis's comment. It just reminds me so much of how important Huntingtonian civilizational discourse and ideas was in certain sectors of West Asia, Middle East, and what we're seeing, for example, in Syria with these HTS and these former Al Qaeda and ISIS, movements, that they are in some sense also trying to create a purified, polity from kind of religious difference, out of it, and that there's revanchist, deeply patriarchal, violent. It's very similar in some ways to what we're seeing with genocidal Zionism. It's as a kind of an analog of its own, and that's similar to many of these other kind of interestingly not just extreme nationalist. I think that's what's interesting is it's not just extreme nation state nationalist ideologies, but larger kind of civilizational polities. Maybe there's like Slavic Easternism, all the Eastern Orthodox kind of communities and peoples, this idea that they should be united and they have some unique and intrinsic kind of cultural values, and that's something that we're seeing being exploited in some of the anti-imperialist sorts of discourses. That is also itself deeply conservative. So that just reinforces my feeling that instead of going forward. I think you're right, Francis, that China is a bit different in the way it looks at its current society in relation to its past as continuing a development forward towards a more equal future, rather than a kind of return to, it's really the conservative kind of right-wing capitalist Asian tigers that talked about Asian values and Asian culture and civilization. China isn't doing that in the same way. But it does remind me that there is a lot of purchase with these kind of civilizational ideas that reminds me so much more of the 19th century and, multipolar kind of competition. And instead of us going forward and envisioning and imagining a future world of equity and justice that allows us to be ourselves in speaking our languages and, eating the foods that we love and dressing the way we, enjoy, and that there may be all kinds of differences, but that fundamentally the human and commitment to a just and equitable future society. And instead of talking about that, we're talking about, preserving and protecting, various kinds of either religious or cultural projects that we characterize as civilizations. I think that's a big danger. And we didn't inherit it from Huntington. It existed before Huntington. As I said, it reminds me so much of 19th century, when it wasn't overtly and obviously biological racism and white supremacy. It was the kind of civilizational kind of discourse. And, it just reminds me a lot of that. So I thank Francis for the, for the observations.
Right on. All right, there's some smaller questions here. Doesn't the King of Spain still hold the title of the King of Jerusalem? Yes, I looked it up.
There have been a lot
Um,
of non-resident kings of Jerusalem, let me tell you. There was Louis IX's brother Charles of Anjou, and subsequent Angevin kings who ruled in Sicily and southern Italy, Naples, and they kept calling themselves, the King of Jerusalem, even though they didn't control Jerusalem. But it's sort of a title in absentia, and many a Western kind of king has, garlanded their titles with glorious claims to inheriting. The royal dynastic title over Jerusalem.
yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, it goes back to the Crusades though, and it says
Yeah.
it's a title inherited through his Aragonese, so Aragon inheritance.
Yeah. Well, so this is something for a future Spanish colonialist to try and claim and enforce. I don't rule it out. I mean, this is the thing that's so crazy about these Western dreams of hegemony, is that they're so persistent and so far-fetched, and yet there is a kind of pathological desire and yearning for it that's why I say it's rooted so deeply. That's why going back in this longue durée history is important, because even if people aren't like very conscious of it, it's just part of the culture that people can appeal to in various ways. It's always available there as something deeply rooted in the history of the West.
Yeah. So this question, or this comment, I think the Crusader orders were also a key structure that connected back to the metropole. I think here we're talking about like the Knights Templar and
Yes.
like the
Knights
hospital.
Hospitalers, the Knights of
Yeah, the
St. John of the
Hospitalers.
Hospital. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. They were a key
Any
structure.
Yeah.
Well, they're so interesting, and there's a whole history to talk about there with them. So the only thing that I would say in brief about them is that they were an attempt to sacralize, to allow knights to participate in a kind of religious order like monks, to be monks who fought. So it was a kind of contradiction. And Bernard of Clairvaux wrote this amazing treatise called In Praise of the New Knighthood, a very important monastic churchman, Cistercian abbot, and became a saint. But he was a real propagandist and preacher for the Second Crusade. And he's the one who was sought after to try and provide legitimacy to something that looked very illegitimate, which was to have knights be, in a kind of quasi-monastic order. And how could that be reconciled? So he did his best to do so. But the second really important thing about the Knights Templar and the Order of St. John, the Hospitalers, is that these are like NGOs, they're like global NGOs that developed kind of network that and capacities that didn't exist. So banking, of course there was, these Italian merchants were involved in, the earliest check, which comes from an Arabic word, payment and on credit, bill of credit kind of thing to help finance transactions, commercial transactions in the medieval Mediterranean. But actual banking, international banking, wasn't something easy to organize. And the resources of the Templars and the fact that they raised money in cities across the Latin West, and they developed techniques for accounting, and that you could collect money in one, in like the Holy Land for money that was sort of put and donated and deposited with the Templars in medieval France and Paris, or in Barcelona, etc. This kind of created a network that was trans-regional, cross-cut various polities, that also, when you had consolidation of nation states starting to take place, like in medieval France, where the centralizing power and development of administration the French monarchs, particularly this figure Philip the Fair, is he decided that the Templars, wielded quite a lot of power, had enormous resources that couldn't be easily controlled, and so he charged them with heresy, expropriated all of their wealth, and promoted this idea that they were scandalous people who had, perhaps because they moved so easily between the worlds of the Latin West and the Muslim Middle East, because they had almost by that time 2 centuries of experience working. They often learned the language of Arabic and could conduct diplomacy. They became a kind of cosmopolitan group that could be targeted and scapegoated. And so it's a very famous episode of the trial of the Templars. And that's an interesting side component that is part of the way in which war making, and particularly settler colonial war making, where you've got a metropole and you have this settler colonial society that has to be reinforced, provisioned, resupplied constantly, and is constantly in a state of emergency, that it impelled all kinds of technical developments, like being able to transfer property and resources and do banking in ways that, perhaps without the Crusades, it would have taken much longer for Latin Christian society to develop some of these techniques that we associate with early commercialization, with, capitalist transformation. And again, the Crusades play an important role in state making and in capital formation.
Yeah, thank you. Adim asked the question, did Norman success in the Mediterranean serve as a blueprint for European polities to break through into Asian markets? In that sense, Christian/Roman nostalgia becomes an alibi for a plunder push.
Well, I did sort of talk about early colonialism and primitive accumulation, through piracy, crusading, kind of colonial conquest, and so on. So it definitely, I don't know how far, yes, into Asia, if you count, South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, that the Portuguese, of course, the east coast of Africa, and setting trading posts and entrepôts and military bases and so on, and then doing the same, in a place like Goa, and then further, into the South Seas, Macau, again, a Portuguese enclave, through colonial control. And so it definitely, I see a lot of continuity between the more commercial and geopolitical and strategic interests of later Crusades in the late 12th and 13th centuries, with attempts to get involved and control parts of the Indian Ocean trade through the Red Sea, as just a continuation of that same process, when they were blocked by being able to go through the narrow land bridge between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea through Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. They had to go the long way around and innovate new techniques that they had already started developing with maritime developments, galleys, and naval warfare in support of the Crusades. Then they just deployed these same techniques and developments in the Atlantic world to circumvent West Asia and get to further South and East Asia around Africa.
Awesome. Someone asked, what role did the Mamluks or
the Mamluks, yes,
Mamluks play in defending the Islamic world against the Crusaders and Mongols during their reign?
Well, they played a major role in both those two challenges that Ibn al-Athir, the historian, the world historian I mentioned, who talked about on the west side, and were the Crusaders, the Franks, and on the east were the Mongol invasions. The Mamluks actually, interestingly enough, emerge in with their own dynastic control over Egypt and the Levant as a result of the Crusades. Louis IX's crusade and invasion of Egypt created a crisis in among the last Ayyubid dynasts, that is the descendants, nephews and grandnephews of Salahuddin, who ruled over Syria and Egypt during this period, collapsed in Egypt, and his military corps, who were technically, Mamluk means somebody who's owned and possessed. So they were military slaves. So the generals in the army, the military and political elite, the governors, the generals were technically slaves to the household of the Ayyubid Sultan. They have a coup and first install actually Shajarat ad-Dur, his wife, the wife of the last Ayyubid, and then they have a full kind of coup revolution and install one of their own emirs as the sultan. And it was an interesting kind of form of dynastic control, because any of the top Mamluks could technically become the sovereign, right? So there was a kind of like oligarchic military class of rulers of Egypt who were the ones who were most successful ultimately in defeating the Crusader states. Qalawun and Baybars are two of the most famous sultans, Mamluk sultans of Egypt and the Levant, who defeated Crusaders, in particular. I believe it was Baybars in 1291 who defeated the last enclave in Acre. And the Mamluks also were the front line against Mongol Ilkhanate control of the western parts of West Asia to the Mediterranean. And there's a lot of discussions among historians whether the reason they managed to defeat the Mongols, who otherwise seemed almost insurpassable and undefeatable during that era in forging the largest land empire in the contiguous land empire in the history of the world, because of their military techniques. Was it their military discipline? And these Mamluks were often Turkic or Circassian peoples who were captives and then sold, trained, converted to Islam, sold and trained, educated to become the military, elite, right, of Egypt and the Levant. And so they did have, in many cases, steppe roots themselves from Central Asia, as other Turkic peoples. And so some people suggest that there was this like hostility, a rivalry between, these Chagatai or West and other Turkic peoples versus the Mongols. But I had an instructor who wrote about this victory of the Mamluks at Ain Jalut in the 13th century that stopped the forward advance of the Mamluks, who argued that the reason why they were successful had less to do with any of their own particular military organizational techniques, so those must have played a role. They had to obviously be a strong military force, but it was because there wasn't enough forage and pasturage for the 4 to 5 horses that each Mongol warrior from the steppes carried with them, and that as a result, in the arid and desertified regions of what is modern day Jordan and Syria, they ran out of pasturage. They were weakened, and they couldn't progress further, really, than that, because of their style of military organization, which relied really and was adapted to steppes, the steppe grasslands and other areas. So it's a really, kind of interesting interesting era and period. And the Mamluks are, widely recognized in history of the region as a great kind of ruling force until they were conquered by Selim I, the Ottoman. They ruled until basically 1517, 1520. In Egypt, from the Third Crusade, from the Seventh Crusade of Louis IX in 1250, 1251 to 1517, but then they were absorbed into the Ottoman Empire.
Wow. As Leah said, an encyclopedia of knowledge. I'll just use that to say, folks, please go over, subscribe to Adnan's channel, and you can he's got a bunch of conversations up there already. I'm sure he'll have more there. And of course, check the show description. I hope all of you are already subscribed to Guerrilla History on all of your podcast platforms and everything else. But if you're not, then you definitely absolutely should be. Um, and I'll leave you with one more question from the audience, and then we'll get out of here on this one. So the question came out: when does the concept of Judeo-Christian civilization come? When does it come from? Where does it come from? I don't know the answer to that.
Surprising answer for you. The 1950s. It's a post-World War II construct. If you asked anybody in my era that we've been talking about Judeo-Christian culture and society, they would not have understood, recognized. They would have, in fact, been scandalized by it, because Christian society was increasingly seeing itself not only as superseding and following after and displacing the era of the Old Testament, right, the Hebrew Bible, but as inimical to it and in fact threatened by Jewish subversion. This is the era, the great massacres that I mentioned, is Crusade massacres. They said, well, we are going to fight the enemies of Christ, but we have enemies of Christ who are living among us. And so they should either be forced to convert, they should be pillaged to finance the crusade, or they should be slaughtered, right? And so the biggest massacres of Jews that start off a history of great pogroms and horrible oppression that changed the relationship between Jews and Christians, which had been won according to the doctrine of St. Augustine, who we've already talked about, who wrote the City of God and wrote the Confessions. People may have come across his writings. He argued in, I believe it's De Doctrina Christiana, that the doctrine of Jewish witness, that Jews were witness to the truth and the preservation of the text of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. They themselves could not see the spiritual truths that obviously, to anybody who is open to it, of Christian salvation, of the coming of Jesus being predicted. All you had to do was look at the binding of Isaac and see that the crucifixion is clearly an allegory. It's being predicted, that the sacrifice of the son will actually happen in Jesus. But the Jews were prevented from being able to see the truth of the Messiah already coming, and as a result they were displaced historically. Their temple was destroyed and they were put into exile, but that was of benefit to the world because they preserved the text of the Hebrew Bible, all the places that they were dispersed to, and anybody else could look and see that it wasn't that the Christians had made up all of this stuff about the coming of Jesus and salvation and so on, but it was right there in the Hebrew Bible, even though the Jews themselves couldn't see it. So there was a function that they played, and as a result, Augustine said, this is how they exist in Christian society. They serve a function. They should be servants to the Christians and subservient, but slay them not. You can tolerate their existence because there's actually a benefit to their persistence in time. And at the end of time, which is not imminent, according to Augustine. I mean, usually apocalyptic thinkers always say we're right on the cusp of the apocalypse. Otherwise, why talk about it? But so he was like saying, no, we've got time. We need to build Christian society. They can be subordinate members of it. They can't rule over Christians. A Christian shouldn't be a servant in a household of a Jew, these kinds of things, but they still serve a purpose. So don't, annihilate them. That starts to, be change. That starts to change in the 12th and the 13th centuries, where they imagine the blood libel. Jews are, killing a Christian youth and using his blood in some kind of macabre counter Passover ritual. They are stealing the host, the wafers that will become the body of Christ, or even if they can get their hands on one, and then they are torturing it in order to re-crucify Christ. The idea that Jews are deicides, they killed Jesus, it becomes legion. And so as a result, for so much of medieval and post-medieval history, Christians saw Jews as an inimical force that could subvert Christian society. So this idea of Judeo-Christian society is a recent invention post-Holocaust to kind of repair, you might say, the consequences, the devastating genocidal consequences of anti-Semitic racism, in the Holocaust and in the course of World War II. So I like to talk about a Judeo-Christian Islamic civilization of the Mediterranean, because these three religions all had so much interaction with one another, had dialogues, shared roots. The kinds of things I used to study before I got so interested in the Crusades was stories of how theological ideas and views in one religion became important and significant and had influence in the other. And I would say that there was a much closer connection, for example, historically speaking, for centuries and centuries, a millennia, almost a millennia and a half, between Jews and Muslims, because there was this constant, and not just in the Latin West, but even in the Eastern Christian Orthodox, there was a very hostile anti-Judaism because of this relationship between Christianity as superseding, using the same scripture, but interpreting it in a radically different way, and blaming the Jews as, a community that failed to see the Messiah that they were expecting, right? So there was a very hostile relationship and a rivalry that existed there, whereas Judaism and Islam, as religions that also, unlike Paul, didn't dispense with an idea of communal regulations and religious law, but actually shared these traditions, had a very radical monotheistic orientation, had a lot of kind of intellectual intersection and dialogue during the medieval period. So somebody like Maimonides, the greatest Jewish rabbi, was a philosophically oriented theological thinker who really liked Al-Ghazali, a very famous and important Muslim religious scholar who was influential even on somebody like Thomas Aquinas in reconciling reason and revelation, these traditions of how philosophy and faith could try and be reconciled in some coherent sort of relationship and way. So, what we see is that there are a lot of interconnections. I prefer to talk about, as I said, a Judeo-Christian Islamic culture of the Mediterranean. These religious cultures had so much relationship to one another, and that the invention of Judeo-Christian civilization is a modern and recent one that kind of reproduces, in a way, you could say, exactly what I was saying, the way in which you can recover Judaism and Jews as long as they will be, settler colonists on behalf of the West, and preferably leave, Europe and North America and go there to rid us of the Jewish question and the Jewish problem, and recover them as now almost converted into, through Zionism, through Jewish settler colonial status as a frontier state of the West. They can be Europeanized, Westernized, through this kind of alchemical transmutation, right? And that's what Judeo-Christian civilization, in terms of inventing it and pretending that existed over this whole period of time, when in fact, if you want to say what existed, was a broader kind of culture of the monotheistic religious traditions in relation, in competition, in dialogue, and sometimes in, ideological conflict, sometimes, in coexistence in multi-faith and multi-religious societies of the medieval Mediterranean world.
Awesome. Thank you. I know already, a future conversation that we could delve into for sure. That was great. Thanks so much, Adnan. This has been great. And really appreciate it. Definitely encourage people to check out, all your other work, connect with you, support you on Patreon and all of that.
I had so much fun, and I really appreciate the comments and the questions as well. I apologize for going on sometimes at length. You get me going on stuff that I'm really excited and passionate about, and, things flow out. I hope it was interesting and useful in having a longer historical perspective on contemporary issues and reframing them in new ways that hopefully you as an audience out there, will find interesting. And I really appreciated the great questions that I got. I expected no less from, my favorite podcast. So thank you so much for having me as a guest on the show.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. This was great.